Hi, my name is Anaya Dixon, and I am part of the Performance of Literature class for UNT. Recently, for the last few weeks, I've been engaging in the EDLP, which is the Everyday Life Performance Project, in which we were assigned a partner and given the task of performing our own study of radical empathy by telling a story. My story was given to my partner, and their story was given to me, and we were supposed to perform and enact each other's stories to engage in what we call the empathetic process. And today I'm going to be talking more about what this entails for me as both an actor in society, but an actor in my own life, trying to perform for another actor within their own performance from my perspective in their life. So, first and foremost, we have a few questions we're going to be going over before we actually begin today's analysis over the empathetic process, and we'll be answering these throughout. So, to start with, what was it like for you to try and fully embody your partner's story? For me to try to fully embody my partner's story, it was a little awkward at first, I can admit. And I feel like a lot of what was awkward about it was more just me trying not to become too terribly stereotypical or embody their story in a way that might be somewhat rude. Now, to go back to this, the textbook we have, which is the Pelias and Schaefer, The Interpersonal Interpretations of Aesthetic Text, second edition. The textbook talks about how when it comes to the empathetic process implies that we share the understanding and feelings of others on page 102. And achieving such an empathetic process can be a difficult task for people like me because it demands that we work through our fundamental steps of recognition, convergence, and adoption. And throughout these, the next page on 103 states that we as objective speakers suppress our biases. And just like I stated before, it was somewhat difficult for me to sometimes suppress my own biases for what a person such as him might act like. Because from my perspective, his story may seem somewhat weird, his attitudes may seem somewhat foreign to me, and I may over exaggerate certain of those characteristics for the sake of trying to embody him, which does him an injustice because it's simply not accurate. Going on, the Pelias and Schaefer book states that objectivity allows listeners to receive, to the extent that their objectivity is possible, an unbiased account. So for me to perform his story means that I first have to be objective, even though I suppress my biases that I have against him, and secondly, I have to give as best I can an unbiased account to adequately do his story justice. So, going on with this. Next, we are posed with our secondary question. The second question we're asked to answer is as follows. What was it like, or what did I learn about my speaker? My partner, first and foremost, I learned a lot about him. First and foremost, he has a good sense of humor. I found out he loves his family, he's very close with them, and even though from his outward external perspective he didn't seem like the most emotional person, he has a gentle side and a love for his family, something that can't be broken. He's very close with them. And so, on an empathetic level, I would say that I do empathize with him because I love my family too, and we're very close as well. But on a deeper, less superficial part, recognition, the first step of the empathetic process, requires me to see that the person's feelings initiate the empathetic process and they're unique and original. Just because I both have a family and I love them does not mean that I can understand his bond to both his grandmother in the story or his father. Secondly, when it goes down to the convergence aspect, I understand that in this way, I am both a listener and a speaker, a partaker of his story in his world. But I can't even begin to converge my ideals or how I feel about a scenario because I'm not him playing in his unique perspective in society. Now, this step of the empathetic process involves understanding the intricate dimensions of the speaker's point of view. He's both male, he's a young male, he is a Caucasian male, he is an American citizen, he's close with his family, he has both a mother and a father who love him. All of these different perspectives that play into who he is have to do with who he is as an actor within his story. As a woman of color, so to speak, a woman in the 21st century, 18 years old, a female, a Texan, all of my experiences may be different in relation to how I view my family members, but it doesn't mean that my story is going to be any necessarily different than his. However, the perspective will be. Now, going off of this, what was it like seeing my story performed, and what did I learn about myself? Well, my story when I saw it performed by Dylan I felt like it was robbed of its justice. My zest when I speak, my personality, I feel like it was deprived. And a lot of that, I think, has more to do with my familiarity with how I speak, the fact that when I talk, I try to make my words meaningful. I try to make every movement expression, really any action I do, I want those to be purposeful. And so when I saw my story performed by another person, it almost made it feel like all of those attitudes, the zest I put in my word choice, my actions, my expressions, I felt like those were wiped away and washed completely dry, which almost gives my words in the story little to no meaning, because without those secondary characteristics, my words, my clothes, my hand movements, those gestures, all of that was not there. And the story, even though the words themselves are still present within the story, when my partner is trying to perform the story itself, it's not the same, because as statistics will tell you, 70% of communication is nonverbal, and that comes in the form of my eye contact, my hand gestures, my hair, my clothes, everything. So even though he tried his best to do my performance well, he's not Nanea, and at the same rate, I'm not him. So when I learned that so much of how we perform has to do with the physical aspects and characteristics, it's made me learn more about myself to see that a lot of how I communicate is simply not verbal. Even if a lot of the words I say are verbose, they're big, they're vibrant, most of how I communicate is external, and it can't be rewritten to give it that full body that it has when I say it or when I tell the story, so to speak. And so, how does this experience of this type of performance relate to the examples of the Tale of Two Schools in the Notes from the Field? Well, in the Tale of Two Schools, we see the richer children and the what we might call disadvantaged children coming together to exchange each other's perspectives. But these examples just show us from my time performing my partner's story and his time performing my own that when it comes to performance, we can try to embody another person as best we want to, but it's never going to be as genuine. I can, of course, empathize with another person by virtue of being a human being with complex emotions, but I can never be that person. Just like how the poor children may see the upper echelon as something that they can never achieve, but it still exists because they're, so to speak, they are performers within the larger scheme or the act of life. Both the rich and the poor exist, but the poor cannot simply embody what it is to be rich because they've never experienced it. And similarly, the richer children may not understand what it's like to be less privileged, even though they can try to empathize because they'd never like to be in the same situation. They can't do it justice because they don't understand the complex moving parts to being a person living within that societal echelon. Very similarly, me and my partner are two different people. We both have unique stories to tell. They're very different radically, but at the point of humanity, we can both understand what it's like to have good families, love them, and live out the best of our abilities, as human beings in a larger, grander scheme of the act of life. So, going on, we could also see that according to the 106 page part 2 of the Peleus and Schaeffer book, it says that another's feelings become firmly planted or solidified as one's own. Just like how in the Tale of Two Schools, these children tried to embody the other perspective, so to speak, as their own, but they couldn't really internalize it because it's a life they had never known. It was the same with me and Dylan. And going on, the book says that security within another person's perspective, however, may take various forms. On the first level, listeners might adopt a feeling based on stereotypes. So these children in A Tale of Two Schools knew nothing more than the stereotypes associated with high living to low living because they've never been in that position. You can assume that, for example, children who are from a more well-advantaged background may be somewhat spoiled, and that's exactly what the other children from the lower echelon thought, because they again saw these children as being somewhat condescending, somewhat bratty, because they had everything. Very similarly, the more privileged children saw the less advantaged children as being somewhat perhaps lazy, maybe even less cultured, because they didn't have the access to the experiences that every other child might have. And so conclusively, when it comes down to the next level of adopting the other person's feelings based on your dispositional traits, we know a person's personality based on how they act, but we don't know that person's personality as to why they act like that. My partner may seem to be maybe somewhat not expressive, not emotional to me, but that's only because I only see him from a projective identification standpoint. Very similarly, I might see his performance of my person as being somewhat boring because I emote a lot, but that's only because I find that to be more enriching for my audience, but he may not see it like that. And lastly, The primary issue with the adoptive step is the degree to which listeners take into account the unique dimensions of others. And as we have seen, the empathetic process of recognition, convergence, and adoption is too complex for us to actually internalize. So, conclusively speaking, when I finish today's speech off, we have to understand that just like the book said, the empathetic process is complex. We have to make sure to be objective and not perform or insert our own biases into the story of another. So therefore, today, after performing my partner's story, I've learned a lot about him, a lot about myself, but more specifically, that empathy requires us to both put ourselves in the perspective of another person, but not embody their story as though we are them. So thank you so much for listening.